The last coin Eli Blackwell pressed into the ticket agent's hand was so worn down from months of living rough that the man had to hold it up to the lantern light, just to confirm it was legal tender. And when he finally nodded and slid the paper ticket across the counter, Eli let out a breath he felt like he had been holding since the day Clara Gentry had boarded the eastbound stage without him. That had been 4 months ago, in the autumn of 1874, when the high desert of New Mexico Territory still held its amber warmth, and the cottonwoods along the Rio Salado burned gold before they let go of their leaves. Eli had stood in the street outside the Dusty Creek General Store and watched the stage carry her away, and something in his chest had cracked open like dry earth after a long drought. He had told himself it did not matter. He had told himself a man with no land, no savings, and no future worth speaking of had no business chasing a woman like Clara Gentry across the country. He had repeated those words to himself every single day for 4 months, until he stopped believing a single one of them. Now it was the 3rd week of January 1875, and the station at Albuquerque smelled of coal smoke and cold iron, and Eli stood on the platform in his worn leather duster, his hat pulled low against a wind that had no mercy in it, with nothing in his pockets but the train ticket and the folded letter he had read so many times the crease marks had turned white. He had no bedroll. He had no saddle. He had sold his horse 2 weeks ago just to eat long enough to reach this moment. He was 27 years old, lean and dark-eyed and stubborn as any creature God had ever put on the earth, and he was getting on that train. The locomotive heaved into Albuquerque at 7:30 in the morning, its iron body steaming and groaning like something alive and tired. Eli watched it slow and felt his heart pick up its pace. He gripped the letter through the fabric of his coat pocket, a habit that had become almost a prayer. The letter was from Clara herself, written 3 weeks after she had left New Mexico, mailed from her aunt's house in Kansas City. It was only a page and a half, and it was not a love letter in the direct sense of the word, but it contained a line near the bottom that Eli had carried in his chest like a small burning coal ever since he had first read it. The line said simply, "I think about Dusty Creek more than I ought to, and I think you know what I mean by that." He knew exactly what she meant. He had always known. Clara Gentry had come to Dusty Creek in the spring of 1874 from St. Joseph, Missouri, following her younger brother Thomas, who had gone west 2 years before to try his luck with cattle ranching. Thomas Gentry had done well enough to send for Clara after their mother passed, leaving Clara with no real ties to St. Joseph, and a quiet, steady kind of courage that had impressed Eli from the first afternoon he laid eyes on her. She had been standing at the edge of the main street with a travel bag in each hand, squinting against the New Mexico sun with the expression of someone who had decided to be unafraid even if it cost her something. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with a directness in her gaze that made most men uncomfortable, and made Eli feel immediately and entirely awake. He had not introduced himself that first day. He had simply tipped his hat from across the street and kept walking, because that was what a man did when he recognized something important and did not yet know what to do about it. But Dusty Creek was not a large town. There were perhaps 200 souls living within riding distance of its single main street, which meant that Eli Blackwell and Clara Gentry were going to end up in the same places whether they arranged it or not. He found her at the Hendersons' supper table 3 days later, Thomas having introduced her around, and Eli sat across from her and listened to her talk about the railroads expanding west and the way the Missouri River looked in winter and the particular quality of silence in a room full of people who were all pretending to be comfortable, and he thought he had never heard anyone describe the world so precisely. He had courted her slowly, which was not in his nature, because his nature was to move fast and work hard and trust his instincts, but something about Clara made him want to be careful. He brought her wildflowers he found along the creek bank. He fixed a broken wheel on her brother's wagon without being asked, and she noticed, which told him she was observant in the way he valued. He taught her how to tell the difference between the tracks of a jackrabbit and a cottontail in the dust, and she taught him how to play chess on the small board she had brought from Missouri, and he beat her at it only once, which genuinely delighted her. By midsummer, there had been something between them that everyone in Dusty Creek could see even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. Thomas Gentry had given Eli a long, measuring look one evening and then said, in the way older brothers said such things, that he hoped Eli had intentions and not just inclinations. Eli had told him he had intentions, and he meant it, but intentions required means, and Eli's means were thin. He was working as a trail hand for the Alderman Ranch, which paid fair, but left him no closer to owning land or building something permanent. He had started talking to the bank manager about a small parcel of land east of town, 12 acres with a creek running through it and enough grass to run a modest herd, but the numbers had not yet been working in his favor. He was saving. He was building towards something, and Clara knew this because he had told her, on a warm August evening sitting outside on the bench in front of Thomas's house with the stars burning above them, that he was working toward a life that would be worth offering her. She had looked at him in that direct way of hers and said that she was not asking him for a life. She was asking him to be honest with her. He had told her then plainly that he was in love with her, that he had been in love with her since she stood on that street with 2 bags and the sun in her face and refused to look afraid, that whatever he was building it thinking about her. She had been quiet for a long moment, and then she had said, very quietly, that she felt the same way about him, but that she had learned not to build plans around feelings before the ground was stable. He had wanted to argue. He had not argued, and then 3 weeks later everything changed when Thomas Gentry took ill. It was not a dramatic illness. It was the kind that started as a cough and slowly, stubbornly, refused to leave, and by September it had settled into Thomas's lungs with a permanence that frightened Clara deeply. Thomas's neighbor and fellow rancher, an older man named Harlan Prout, had suggested that the dry heat of New Mexico might be making things worse, that some men with lung trouble did better in different climates, and had recommended Thomas consider going east to be seen by a proper physician. Thomas could not afford to close up his operation and move. But Clara could go on his behalf to their father's sister in Kansas City, who had connections to a good doctor there, and could bring Thomas under the care he needed if Clara went ahead and arranged things. It was a practical plan. It was a necessary plan. Eli had understood this completely and had hated every moment of it. She had left on a Tuesday in early October, on the stage that connected to the eastbound rail line at Albuquerque. Eli had ridden alongside the stage for the first 3 miles before the driver told him gently, but firmly, that he needed to turn back. Clara had looked at him through the window with those dark, steady eyes of hers, and said something he could not hear through the glass and the noise of the wheels, and he had watched her face until the stage crested a low hill and disappeared. Thomas had gotten on the train east himself 6 weeks later, doing better enough to travel, heading toward Kansas City to join his sister and begin treatment. He had shaken Eli's hand before he went and said that he expected Eli to come after them when he was able, and that he should not wait too long because Kansas City was a large place with a great many eligible men, said with the half-smile of a man who trusted his sister's heart, but also knew that life did not stay still. Eli had worked through the rest of October and November, saving every cent, selling things when he had to, sleeping in the bunkhouse, and eating as little as he could manage. He sold his good saddle in December. He sold his horse, a bay gelding named Rook that he had owned for 5 years, in the first week of January. He had stood at the fence after the new owner rode Rook away and put his forehead against the cold wood rail for a long moment, because a man's horse was not a small thing to give up, and then he had straightened up and counted his money and found he had exactly enough for the train ticket, not enough for food on the journey, Not enough for lodging in Kansas City. Not enough for anything beyond the ticket itself and the getting there. He had bought the ticket anyway. The locomotive from Albuquerque ran northeast through the broad, flat basin country, and then picked up the main line that would carry him across the territory and into Kansas. Eli sat in the second-class car, which was cold despite the small stove at its center, and watched the New Mexico desert give way to the bleached grasslands of the Eastern Territory. He had nothing to eat. He had a canteen of water he had filled at the Albuquerque station. He had his hat and his coat and his boots and the letter, and an absolute, unshakable sense of purpose that had replaced every other resource he had ever owned. The man sitting across from him in the second-class car was a heavy-set merchant from Santa Fe named Floyd Danders, who was traveling to Dodge City on business. Floyd had a large cloth bag that he opened around midday to produce a significant amount of food, including hard biscuits, dried beef, and 3 apples, and when he noticed that Eli was sitting very still and staring out the window with the expression of a man ignoring his own hunger, Floyd offered him a biscuit and a strip of dried beef without making a thing of it. Eli accepted it with more gratitude than he could comfortably put into words, and Floyd waved him off and said that anyone riding second class in January had already had a hard enough time without going hungry on top of it. They talked for a while as the landscape moved past the fogged windows, and Eli found himself telling Floyd about Clara in a way he had not exactly planned on. He said that he was going to Kansas City to see a woman who did not yet know he was coming. Floyd raised his eyebrows and asked if that was wise. Eli said he did not know if it was wise, but that there was a letter in his pocket that said things he could not stop thinking about, and that when a man read the same page 100 times, it probably meant he should stop reading it and start moving. Floyd considered this for a moment and then said it was either the most romantic thing he had ever heard or a recipe for disaster, and that he sincerely hoped for Eli's sake it was the former. Eli hoped so too. The train stopped in Dodge City for 4 hours to take on water and coal and exchange some freight cars, and during those 4 hours Eli walked the length of the main street, which was quieter in January than its fearsome reputation suggested, and he sat for a while in the warmth of a diner where the owner, a woman named Mrs. Croft, refilled his coffee twice without charge when she noticed he was not ordering anything else. He sat with the warmth of the cup in his hands and thought about Clara. He thought about the way she laughed, which was sudden and real, and surprised her as much as it surprised anyone else. He thought about the way she had pressed her palm flat against his chest one afternoon in September, just briefly, just for a moment, in a gesture that was not a grand declaration but somehow contained more than either of them had yet said out loud. He thought about what he was going to say to her when he got to Kansas City. He had been thinking about this for the entire train ride and had not yet arrived at a version of it that satisfied him. He was not a man who was comfortable with pretty speeches. He was better with action, but showing up at a woman's aunt's door in the middle of winter with empty pockets and a 4-month absence between them required some kind of words, and he had better find the right ones before the train pulled into Kansas City. He got back on the train in Dodge City, feeling the cold settle into his coat, and he watched through the window as the flat grasslands of Kansas opened up around the moving locomotive. The sky was enormous here, gray-white and low, and there was the particular silence of winter prairie that a person either found peaceful or unbearable, and Eli found it peaceful, the way he found most vast and empty things peaceful, because he had grown up in them and learned their language early. He slept for a few hours, which he needed badly, and woke to darkness outside the windows and the lights of small towns passing at intervals. He pressed his face against the cold glass and watched a farmhouse drift past, one yellow window glowing in the dark, and thought about what it meant to have a place where a light was always burning for you. He had not had that kind of place in a long time. He wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything he could name. The train arrived at Kansas City's Union Station on the afternoon of the following day, and Eli stepped off onto the platform into air that smelled of coal smoke and river water, and the particular cold that the Missouri River dragged with it in January. The station was enormous by the standards of anything he had experienced in New Mexico. There were hundreds of people moving through it, men in suits and women in heavy coats and porters pushing carts stacked with luggage, and the sound of it all bounced off the high ceilings and made a kind of roar that was almost physical. Eli stood on the platform with his hands in his coat pockets and absolutely nothing else to his name, and he felt, for just a moment, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. He had spent his last dollar on this ticket. He was standing in the largest city he had ever set foot in, knowing no one, owning nothing, having eaten one meal in the past 36 hours. The address for Clara's aunt was written on the back of the letter: Mrs. Patience Alcott, 14 Birchwood Lane, Kansas City, Missouri. He did not know how far that was from the station. He squared his shoulders, pulled his hat down against the wind, and walked out of the station into Kansas City. He found a man loading crates onto a wagon outside the station's main doors and asked him the distance to Birchwood Lane, and the man told him it was about 2 miles east, nothing that would take him more than 30 or 40 minutes on foot. He thanked the man and started walking. Kansas City in January 1875 was a city in the full swing of its expansion. The stockyards were booming. The rail lines were multiplying. The streets along the river district were loud with the commerce of cattle and grain and the steady push of westward freight. But as Eli moved east and north, away from the river district, the streets quieted into residential neighborhoods, with houses set back from wide, unpaved roads and bare elm trees standing in rows, and the city began to feel less overwhelming and more like a place where people actually lived. Birchwood Lane was a modest, respectable street. The houses were frame-built, 2-story, most of them with shutters painted some dark color and small front porches that were too cold to use in January, but which had the look of being well used in warmer months. Number 14 had a picket fence that someone had recently painted white, and a front walk lined with the dried stalks of last summer's flowers. There was a light in the front window. Eli stopped at the gate and stood there for a full minute. He was aware, suddenly and completely, of how he must look. He had not shaved in 4 days. His coat was worn at the cuffs. His hat had been his working hat, not his good hat, and the road and the train had not improved it. He had nothing to offer as a calling card, no flowers, no gift, no introduction beyond himself. He pushed the gate open and walked up the front path and knocked on the door. He heard movement inside, and then the sound of voices, too muffled to identify, and then footsteps approaching the door, and then the door opened. The woman who opened it was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pinned neatly and an expression that was cautious but not unkind. She was wearing a house dress and a wool shawl and holding the door with the particular wariness of someone who had answered enough unexpected knocks to know they did not always bring good news. Eli removed his hat. He said, "Ma'am, my name is Eli Blackwell. I'm from Dusty Creek, New Mexico. I'm a friend of Clara Gentry's, and I'd like to see her if she's willing." The woman, who could only be Patience Alcott, looked at him for a long, careful moment. Her eyes moved over him with the efficient appraisal of someone who had lived long enough to read people quickly, and Eli stood still and let her look, because he had nothing to hide and no way to pretend he was anything other than what he was. And then from behind Patience Alcott came a voice that was so familiar to him that his chest went tight the moment he heard it. Clara said from somewhere inside the house, "Aunt Patience, who is it?" Patience Alcott's expression shifted. Something moved through it that might have been recognition, or surprise, or the particular satisfaction of a woman who had heard enough about this man to know exactly who was standing on her front porch. She stepped back from the door and said, "Clara, come see." There was a pause, then footsteps. Then Clara Gentry appeared in the doorway, and Eli looked at her, and everything he had rehearsed on the train, every version of the words he had been working on across 2 days of cold and hunger and the rolling grassland country of Kansas, left him completely. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her hair was down around her shoulders, which he had only seen a few times before, and her face when she saw him went through 3 or 4 expressions in rapid succession, none of which he had time to fully name before she said, very quietly, "Eli." He said, "Hello, Clara." She looked at him the way she always looked at him, direct and clear and fully present, and then she said, "You look like you have not slept properly in a week." He said, "It's been closer to 2 days. I came on the train." She looked at him for another long moment and then she said, "You sold Rook, didn't you?" It was not a question. She knew him well enough to know that a man like Eli Blackwell only arrived without his horse if the horse was gone, and that the horse would only be gone if things had gotten as serious as they could get. He said, "Yes." She pressed her lips together in a line that he had learned meant she was feeling something strong that she was taking a moment to organize. Then she pushed the door open wider and said, "You had better come inside. You look cold and you look hungry, and we are going to deal with both of those things before anything else." He walked inside. The house was warm from a wood stove in the parlor and smelled of something cooking in the kitchen, something with onions and broth, and after 2 days of train cold and the bitter walk from the station, the warmth of it was almost startling. Patience Alcott had disappeared toward the kitchen with a tact that Eli was grateful for, leaving him standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands and Clara standing 3 feet away looking at him with that expression that was always equal parts warmth and careful control. He said, "I got your letter." She said, "I know, I sent it." He said, "The part near the end." She said, "I know which part you mean." He said, "I thought about it every day." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How much did the ticket cost you?" He told her. She looked at him steadily and said, "Was that everything?" He said, "Yes." She crossed her arms, not in anger but in the way that meant she was steadying herself, and said, "Eli Blackwell, you came here with nothing." He said, "I came here with myself. I know that isn't much, but I didn't have anything better to bring." She looked at him for a long moment and her eyes were very bright, and then she uncrossed her arms and closed the distance between them in 2 steps and put her hand against his chest, in exactly the same place she had pressed her palm in September, and she looked up at him and said, "It is the most that anyone has ever brought me." He put his hand over hers. He said, "Clara, I love you. I have loved you since the day you stood in the middle of Dusty Creek with the sun in your face and refused to be afraid. I have nothing to offer you right now except that I am here and I intend to stay and I intend to build something worth having, and I would like to build it with you beside me. But I understand if the timing is not right, or if you need more than I can give at the moment, or if this was the wrong thing to do." She said, "Will you please stop talking so that I can tell you something?" He stopped. She said, "I wrote you that letter because I was sitting in my aunt's house in Kansas City in October, surrounded by very comfortable furniture and a perfectly acceptable life that had nothing of New Mexico in it, and I could not sleep. And when I finally figured out why I could not sleep, it was because I was trying not to think about you, and I was failing at it completely. So I wrote the letter, and then I waited to see if you were going to do anything about it." He said, "It took me a little while to save the fare." She said, "I know. Thomas told me you had sold nearly everything." He said, "Thomas wrote to you about it." She said, "Thomas wrote to me that you were working yourself into the ground and refusing to take the foreman's offer of an advance on your wages because you didn't want to start anything in debt. He said you were the most stubborn and principled man he had ever known, and that I should probably make up my mind about you before some other woman in Kansas City made it up for me." Eli thought about Thomas Gentry, who was upstairs in this house being treated for his lungs, and felt a surge of affection for the man that he could not immediately find words for. He said, "How is Thomas?" Clara's expression softened with relief and something more complicated. She said, "Better. The doctor here says his lungs are not as far damaged as we feared. He needs rest and clean air and time, but the doctor is cautiously hopeful. She paused. Thomas will be glad you came. He was beginning to give up on your timing. He said, I'm sorry it took so long. She said, you are here now. She was still standing very close to him, her hand still over his chest, and he was looking down at her in the warm parlor light, and he said, quietly and plainly, say you'll have me, Clara. Say it clearly so I know it's true. She looked up at him with those dark, direct eyes, and she said, I will have you, Eli, clearly, so you know it's true. He kissed her then, because there was nothing else to be done about it. And she kissed him back without any of the hesitation he might have expected. And the warmth of the house around them, and the smell of supper cooking, and the fact that he had not eaten properly in 2 days, and had sold his horse, and spent his last cent to get to this particular room with this particular woman, all seemed to compress themselves into the single most complete moment he could remember. When they stepped apart, Patience Alcott appeared in the doorway from the kitchen with a perfectly composed expression, and said that supper would be ready in 20 minutes, and that there was a washroom off the hallway, and that she expected Mr. Blackwell would like to make use of it before they sat down to eat. Eli said he would, very much, and thanked her. Patience Alcott looked at him with the same careful appraisal she had used on the doorstep, and then she said, in a tone that contained both approval and a certain amount of warning, Clara has told me a great deal about you, Mr. Blackwell. She said you were honest and stubborn, and that you worked harder than anyone she had ever known. She did not mention that you would come to my door in January looking like you'd ridden the wind here. He said, I came on the train, ma'am. I apologize for the state I'm in. Patience said, don't apologize, just go wash your face. A man who spends his last dollar to reach a woman doesn't need to apologize for much. He washed his face and hands in the small washroom and looked at himself in the mirror above the basin. And the man looking back at him was road-worn and thin-faced from 2 days of minimal food and 2 months of working and saving and living lean. But there was something in his eyes that had not been there before he knocked on the door. Something settled. Something that recognized itself. Supper at Patience Alcott's table was more food than Eli had sat down to in weeks, and it was good food. A thick beef stew with root vegetables, fresh bread that was still warm from the oven, and strong coffee that Patience kept in a pot on the table without comment. Thomas came downstairs for supper, moving slowly but with more color in his face than Eli had feared, and when Thomas saw Eli sitting at the table, he stopped in the doorway and said, Well, it's about time. Eli stood and shook Thomas's hand and said it was good to see him and that he looked better than expected. Thomas said he looked better than he felt, but that the gap was closing. He sat down at the table and looked between his sister and Eli with the expression of a man who had placed a wager on an uncertain outcome and was beginning to suspect he had won it, and he said nothing further on the subject, but helped himself to the stew with the satisfied air of someone whose work here was done. They ate and talked, and the warmth of the house held them all, and Eli watched Clara across the table and she watched him back, and the conversation moved around them, and through them, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be even if the circumstances were nothing like he would have planned. After supper, Thomas retired early on the doctor's orders, and Patience excused herself with the same diplomatic tact she had shown all evening, and Eli and Clara sat in the parlor by the stove with coffee cups in their hands and the particular quiet of a winter night outside the windows. Clara said, What do you intend to do next? He said, I'd like to go back to New Mexico. I'd like to go back and buy that piece of land east of town if Alderman will keep me on long enough to save the down payment again. I'd like to build something on it. He paused. I'd like to do all of that with you if you're willing to come back. She said, New Mexico is not Kansas City. He said, No, it is not. Said, There is no doctor within 30 miles of Dusty Creek who is qualified to treat Thomas's condition. He will need to stay here or somewhere like here for at least another year, maybe longer. Eli had thought about this. He said, "I know. I'm not asking you to choose between me and Thomas. I'm asking if there is a way to make both possible." She looked at the stove and was quiet for a moment. She said, "Thomas will not need me to be here every day. He needs the doctor. He needs proper care. Aunt Patience is willing to have him as long as necessary." She looked at Eli. "I came here for Thomas. I stayed because I did not know where else I was going." She paused. "New Mexico always felt like where I was going." He said, "Then come back with me." She said, "You have no horse and no money." He said, "I know. I will have both again. It will take time, but I will have them." She said, "I have a small amount of money saved, enough for the train fare back and a little more." He shook his head immediately and said, "Clara," she said, "do not do that. Do not be proud about money right now. You spent everything you had to get here. Let me make sure we can get back." He was quiet for a moment because she was right and he knew it, and it cost him something to know it. He said, "All right." She said, "Good." He said, "But I want to marry you before we go back. I want it done properly. I'm not asking you to come back to New Mexico as anything other than my wife, if that is what you want. And I know I'm asking without a ring or a plan that is anywhere near ready, and I know the circumstances are not what either of us would have chosen, but I am asking." She looked at him for a long moment, and the fire in the stove popped and settled, and the winter outside pressed its silence against the walls of the house, and she said, "Yes." He said, "Yes to marrying me." She said, "Eli, I have said yes to you twice this evening. I intend to keep saying it." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she held his hand in both of hers, and they sat like that in the warm parlor for a long time, talking about everything and nothing, the way two people talk when they have been apart for months and have so much accumulated inside them that it simply begins to spill. He told her about selling Rook, and she was quiet, and he could tell it moved her. She told him about the weeks in Kansas City, the strange feeling of being in a city again after Dusty Creek, the doctor's visits with Thomas, the evenings at Patience's dinner table, the letter she had written and almost not sent. He told her about the train ride, Floyd Danders, and the biscuit that had kept him going until Dodge City, the gray Kansas sky outside the second-class window, walking 2 miles from the station with nothing in his pockets. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, with her whole attention, and when he was finished she said, "You are the most stubborn man I have ever known." He said, "You've told me that before." She said, "I will probably tell you many more times." He said, "I know." She squeezed his hand and said, "I am very glad you are stubborn." They were married 4 days later, on a Thursday morning in late January, at the small Methodist church 2 streets over from Birchwood Lane. The ceremony was simple because there was no time or money for anything else, and because neither of them wanted anything complicated. Patience Alcott stood with Clara, and Thomas came down in his good coat looking pale but determined, and he stood with Eli. And the minister was a kind, efficient man named Reverend Marsh, who asked the right questions and received the right answers and pronounced them husband and wife, in the time it took the winter sun to move from the eastern window to the southern one. Thomas shook Eli's hand afterward and said, "Take care of her." Eli said, "Always." Thomas said, "I know, that's why I let you." Patience Alcott fed them all a wedding breakfast of eggs and good ham and strong coffee, and there was a small yellow cake that she had made the night before, and they sat around the table and ate it all with the particular mixture of joy and practicality that defined the kind of life all of them were living, in that place and that time, when happiness was not a given but something you built and protected with your hands. Thomas was not well enough to travel, and would not be for some time, and they all knew it and had made peace with it. Eli and Clara would go back to New Mexico. Thomas would stay with Patience and continue his treatment. Clara would write every week. They would return when Thomas was strong enough, or Thomas would come west when the time was right. It was a plan built of good intentions and the kind of pragmatic hope that the West required of everyone who tried to live in it. The train west from Kansas City left on a Saturday morning, and Clara held Eli's hand on the platform while they waited. And Patience Alcott hugged Clara for a long time and then looked at Eli with those assessing eyes and said, "You came here with nothing. You are leaving with everything that matters. Do right by that." He said, "I will. Thank you for what you've done for Thomas and for Clara." Patience patted his arm once briskly and said, "See that the land you build on has good soil and proper water access. Everything else follows from that." He smiled genuinely and said he would remember it. Thomas came to the platform despite the cold, leaning on Patience's arm, and he and Clara held each other for a long moment before she let go and stepped back. And Thomas looked at Eli over his sister's shoulder with the expression of a man sending the two most important things he had in the world off in the same direction, and trusting they would be all right. The train moved west. They rode through Kansas in the gray winter light, and this time Eli was not alone and not hungry, and the difference was so significant that the same plains he had crossed 4 days earlier looked entirely different to him now. Clara sat beside him, her shoulder against his, and watched the flat landscape with the curiosity she brought to everything new, and asked him questions about the country they were passing through, what it looked like in summer, how the grass changed color closer to the territory, what the wildflowers were called that grew in the low places near the creeks. He answered everything he knew and told her honestly when he did not know, and she took it all in with that steady attentiveness that he had loved in her from the beginning. And the hours went by in a way that was nothing like the long, cold, solitary hours of the eastbound journey. They stopped in Dodge City for the layover, and Eli walked her through the main street, which was louder and more inhabited than it had been in the deep January cold a few days earlier, and she looked at everything with interest and no fear, which did not surprise him at all. He bought her coffee from a stall near the stock pens with the small amount of coin they had set aside for the journey, and they stood together in the thin winter afternoon and drank it, and she said that Dodge City was nothing like she had expected and considerably more chaotic. He said that Dusty Creek was considerably quieter than Dodge City. She said she knew. She had lived in it for 6 months. She was glad of it. On the second morning of the westbound journey, they crossed into New Mexico territory, and the landscape shifted in the way it did when the high desert began to assert itself, the colors changing from the muted grays and buffs of the Kansas winter to the dusty reds and ochres of the territorial earth. And Eli watched Clara look at it and saw the moment she recognized it, the moment something in her settled. She said, "It still looks the same." He said, "It always does." She said, "I thought I might feel differently about it coming back." He said, "Do you?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the desert move past the window. She said, "I feel more certain of it than I did when I left." He said, "That's how it works sometimes. You have to leave a place to know whether it belongs to you." She looked at him. She said, "Is that how you felt about me?" He said, "The first day I saw you, I knew you belonged to Dusty Creek. You just didn't know it yet." She laughed, that real, sudden laugh of hers, and leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "That is either very wise or very arrogant." He said, "Probably both." They arrived in Albuquerque in the early afternoon and transferred to the stage line that ran north to Dusty Creek, and the stage rocked and creaked along the desert road in the winter sun. And by the time the familiar outline of Dusty Creek's main street came into view, the light was going golden in the late afternoon, and the mountains to the west were turning purple at their edges. And Clara pressed her face to the window, and Eli watched her face instead of the view because it was better. Dusty Creek received them the way small towns received returning members, with a combination of genuine welcome and intense curiosity about the circumstances. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, came out to the street when she saw the stage and asked Clara directly if that was a wedding ring on her hand. And when Clara said yes, Mrs. Henderson turned to Eli with an expression of complete vindication and said she had told her husband in September that it was only a matter of time. Walt Alderman, who owned the ranch where Eli had worked, came by the next morning and told Eli that his job was waiting for him if he wanted it, and that the foreman's position was still open, because the man who had taken it temporarily had quit in November over a dispute about water rights that had nothing to do with Eli. Eli shook Walt's hand and said he would take both the job and the position. Walt looked at Clara, who was standing beside Eli in the doorway of the rented room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, and said that it was good to have her back in Dusty Creek, that the town was quieter without her. Clara said that she had not known she was making that much noise. Walt said she wasn't, but that some people made their presence felt by what they added, and her absence had been felt accordingly. Clara thanked him and offered him coffee, and Walt declined but seemed pleased by the offer, and went away looking like a man who approved of the general direction of events. The rented room at Mrs. Henderson's was small but clean and warm, and it was enough for now, because enough for now was all that was required. Eli took up the foreman's work at Alderman's Ranch with the same driven efficiency he brought to everything, and the wages were better than his trail hand wages had been, and Clara found work 3 days a week helping the school teacher, a woman named Miss Garrett, with the younger students, because Clara was educated and good with children, and the arrangement suited everyone. She also helped Mrs. Henderson with accounts on Friday afternoons, because Clara had a precise mind for numbers that she had never particularly advertised, but which became apparent quickly to anyone who watched her work. The winter passed in the particular combination of hard work and careful saving, and the slow accumulation of a life being built from its foundation. Eli came home from the ranch each evening tired in the way that good work made a man tired, and Clara had supper ready or nearly ready, and they sat together in the evenings with the lamplight and the cold outside and the warmth they had made between them, and talked about their days and their plans and the small specific details of the life they were assembling. In March, a letter came from Thomas. He was doing better. The doctor was encouraged. He was able to go on short walks. He was already making plans for the spring, talking about whether he could return to his ranch operation by summer if he continued to improve. He wrote that he had met Patience's neighbor, a woman named Ruth Carey, who was a widow with 2 children and a forthright personality, and that he thought of her more than was perhaps appropriate given his current state of health, but that he intended to do something about it when he was stronger. Clara read this letter aloud to Eli and looked at him with the particular delight of a sister who had information, and said that Thomas did not usually mention women in letters. Eli said that Thomas had always been more decisive than he looked. Clara said that was a quality he apparently shared with certain other people she knew. By April, Eli had spoken again to the bank manager about the 12 acres east of town, and the numbers were beginning to work. He had not yet saved the full down payment, but he had more than half of it, and the bank manager, a patient man named Greer who had watched a great many homesteaders try and fail and a few try and succeed, told him that he was on the right track and to come back in the summer. That spring was warm and generous in the way that New Mexico springs could be when the winter had been fair, and the desert bloomed in the low places with the small, fierce flowers that Clara loved, the yellow and purple ones that grew in clusters along the creek banks and the roadsides and the edges of the unfenced land. Eli brought her a handful of the yellow ones one afternoon in April, having stopped to pick them on the way back from the ranch, and Clara put them in a jar of water on the windowsill and looked at them for the rest of the evening with the pleased expression of someone whose happiness had been quietly confirmed. He told her about the 12 acres again, more specifically this time, walking her out to see the land on a Sunday afternoon in May when the light was long and the air smelled of sage and warm earth. He showed her where he planned to put the house, on the slight rise above the creek where the view carried in 3 directions, and the wind came off the mountains clean. He showed her where the barn would go, and where the fencing would run, and where he thought a garden might do well if they managed the water carefully. She stood in the middle of the unbroken land and turned slowly, looking at all of it, and then she said, "There should be a porch on the south side, facing the mountains." He said, "There will be," she said, "and I want a proper kitchen, not a corner, a real kitchen." He said, "You will have it," she said, "and room for children." He looked at her. She was looking at the mountains with an expression of deliberate calm, and there was color in her face that was not entirely from the sun. He said very carefully, "Clara." She turned to look at him and said, "I am not certain yet, but I think so. I will know more in a few weeks." He stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the dry grass between them and took her face in both hands and looked at her and did not immediately find any words, which was not typical of him, and the fact that he could not speak seemed to be enough of an answer for her, because she smiled at him with the whole warmth of her face and put her hands over his. She was certain, 4 weeks later. The 12 acres east of town were purchased in the first week of July, 1875, with a formal agreement signed at Greer's Bank on a Wednesday morning, with Clara beside him and Eli's name on the paper. The down payment had been precisely calculated over 6 months of Foreman's wages and Clara's teaching and accounting work, and the note was affordable against his income. And when Eli walked out of the bank with the deed in his hand, he stood in the summer sun of Dusty Creek's Main Street and felt something shift in him that had been unsteady since before he could clearly remember. He had land. He had his wife beside him. There was a child coming. He had arrived at this moment with nothing but himself, and he had built the rest of it since. The house went up through the summer, because Eli knew how to build, and because the men of Dusty Creek were the kind of community that showed up for a house raising without being formally invited, only needing the news that a man was building on new land. Walt Alderman brought 2 of his hands. The Henderson family contributed lumber they had been keeping for another project and decided could wait. The schoolteacher's husband, a carpenter named Garrett, brought his tools and his expertise and spent 2 weekends framing the structure with a precision that Eli had not expected to be able to afford. Clara was present for all of it, despite the pregnancy becoming apparent in August, because she was Clara and had no particular interest in being managed into the role of delicate observer. She made food for the workers and kept track of which boards had been used where, and argued successfully with Eli about the kitchen window placement in a way that ended with the window being placed where she said, which turned out to be definitively better. The house was livable by September, though not yet finished, and they moved in from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on a clear Saturday in the first week of September, carrying their modest accumulation of possessions through the front door and into the smell of new wood and plaster and the particular quiet of a place that was finally, properly theirs. Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands on her round middle and looked out the window she had argued for and said, quietly, "This is ours." He said, "Yes," she said, "we made this." He said, "We did." She turned and looked at him with the warmth she had always kept a small measure of careful control over, and in this moment there was no control, just warmth, straight through, and she said, "I am so glad you spent that last dollar." He said, "I would have spent it 100 times." She said, "I know. That's the thing about you, Eli. You always would." The letter from Thomas in September brought news that was better than they had dared fully hope for. The doctor in Kansas City had cleared him to return to mild activity. He was planning to come back to New Mexico by spring. He also mentioned Ruth Carey with considerably more detail than before, and ended the letter by saying, somewhat awkwardly for a man who was not accustomed to such announcements, that he intended to ask Ruth to marry him before he left Kansas City if she would have him, because he had realized that life in the West was large and sometimes lonely, and that it was better managed with a good person beside you. Clara read this part of the letter twice and then said, with great feeling, that Thomas had apparently been paying more attention than she had given him credit for. Eli said that Thomas had always struck him as a man who took his time but got to the right place eventually. Clara said, "Like you." Eli said, "I got to you eventually," she said, "after I wrote you a letter all but drawing you a map." He said, "I am grateful for the map." She threw a kitchen towel at him, and he caught it, and the baby kicked in that moment as if weighing in on the exchange. And Clara pressed her hand to her side with the particular startled delight of a woman who had not yet stopped being surprised by this aspect of things. And Eli crossed the kitchen and put his hand where hers was, and felt the movement beneath his palm, and looked at his wife's face. He thought about a train platform in Albuquerque in January. He thought about the last coin pressed across a counter. He thought about arriving in Kansas City with nothing but himself and knocking on a door in the cold. He thought that he would do every bit of it again without a moment's hesitation. Their son was born on the 4th of November 1875, in the bedroom of the house east of Dusty Creek, with the sage-scented wind coming through the window they had cracked open despite the autumn cold because Clara had been determined to have fresh air. The doctor came from Dusty Creek in time, and Mrs. Henderson came as well, and Eli was not entirely kept out of the room the way that custom sometimes demanded, because Clara told the doctor plainly that she wanted her husband there, and the doctor, a practical man, did not argue with her about it. He was there. He held her hand through the hardest of it and watched her be braver than any person had a right to be expected to be, which did not surprise him but moved him profoundly. And when the baby finally arrived into the lamplight of the November night, a boy with a full head of dark hair and a powerful set of lungs, Eli Blackwell put his face into his hands and wept in the open, uncomplicated way that men who have been through a great deal sometimes permit themselves when they have arrived at the far end of it. Clara, exhausted and luminous, held the baby and looked at Eli and said, "Don't cry. You'll start me again." He said, "I'm allowed." She said, "Yes, you are." They named the boy Thomas James Blackwell, after her brother and Eli's own father, and the name sat well on him from the first day, which was a thing you could sometimes tell. The letter to Thomas about his nephew took a week to write, because Clara kept finding more to say, and it was 6 pages when she sealed it, the longest letter Eli had ever seen her write. Thomas's reply came 3 weeks later and was equally long, which was unlike Thomas, and it confirmed that he had indeed asked Ruth Carey to marry him, and that she had said yes, and that he intended to return to New Mexico in the spring with his new wife and begin rebuilding his ranch operation. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was the kind of winter that New Mexico Territory did right, cold and clear and honest, without the brutal wet gray of the eastern winters that Clara had grown up with. The baby grew with the particular rapid efficiency of healthy newborns, and the house on the 12 acres settled into itself in the way that new houses did when people actually lived and worked in them. Eli expanded his savings with a careful eye on buying a few head of cattle by spring. He worked at Alderman's ranch through the winter, but the plan had always been to build his own operation over time, and the first small herd would be the beginning of it. He bought a horse in December, a bay mare with a white face and a calm personality, from a man passing through who needed money quickly. He named her November, because that was the month the boy had been born, and it seemed like a month worth commemorating. Clara said it was an unusual name for a horse, and Eli said all good horses had unusual names. The mare proved to be everything the man had said about her, level-headed and strong and good in rough country, and Eli rode her to the ranch each morning with the particular satisfaction of a man who has replaced a thing he lost and found the replacement adequate. Thomas arrived in Dusty Creek in April of 1876 with Ruth beside him, and Thomas looked better than Clara had seen him in 2 years. The lung trouble had retreated to a manageable whisper rather than the alarming rattle it had been, and the doctor in Kansas City had said that, with continued care and the right climate, there was no reason Thomas could not live a full and active life. He was 31, lean and a little gray at his temples from the illness, and Ruth was 28, a dark-haired woman from Missouri with the capable, direct manner of someone who had managed a household and 2 children on her own, and found it entirely possible. And she and Clara looked at each other for the first 5 minutes with the careful assessment of two women who were each protective of the people they loved. And then they both laughed at something Ruth said. And after that they were friends with the easy completeness of people who recognize their own kind. Thomas met his nephew and held him with the careful reverence of a man who was not accustomed to infants and was not going to admit it was affecting him. And young Thomas James looked up at his uncle with the specific focused attention of a 7-month-old examining something new. And Thomas looked at Clara over the baby's head and said, "He has your eyes." Clara said, "He has Eli's stubbornness." Eli said from the other side of the room, "He is 7 months old." Clara said, "I can already tell." Thomas laughed, and the laugh had no cough behind it, and that alone was worth everything. The spring of 1876 was full in the way that springs in Dusty Creek could be when enough good things were happening at once to make a person slightly overwhelmed by the accumulation of them. Thomas reopened his ranch with help from Eli and several of the neighbors, and Ruth proved to have a practical knowledge of cattle that surprised Thomas and impressed everyone else. Eli bought 4 head of cattle and turned the eastern corner of his 12 acres into the beginning of a proper pasture, and Clara kept the accounts with the precision that had always made Greer at the bank tell Eli he was a lucky man in the specific and practical sense. Clara was expecting again by summer, a fact she announced to Eli on a warm June evening on the south-facing porch, the mountains catching the last light, young Thomas James asleep inside, and Eli took her hand and looked at the mountains and said that he was grateful in a way that he did not entirely have language for. She said, "You say that often." He said, "I mean it every time." She said, "I know, that is one of the things about you." He looked at her, the woman who had stood in the street of Dusty Creek with 2 bags and the sun in her eyes and refused to be afraid, who had written him a letter with a line in it that had redirected the entire course of his life, who had told him yes twice in one evening in her aunt's parlor in January with the snow outside and the stove burning, who had built this life alongside him with the same absolute practical determination she brought to everything. He said, "Clara." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "Tell me." He said, "When I bought that train ticket, I did not know what I was going to find when I got to Kansas City. I knew what I hoped, but I did not know. And I stood on that platform in Albuquerque with nothing in my pockets and everything uncertain, and I thought that even if it did not go the way I hoped, at least I had tried. At least I had not stayed in Dusty Creek talking myself into standing still." He paused. "I have never been more grateful for anything in my life than the fact that you opened that door." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains with the particular expression she wore when she was feeling something large. She said, "I am grateful that you knocked." He said, "I will always knock." She turned and looked at him and smiled, the real, full smile that had always been the most specific and irreplaceable thing about her, the one that arrived suddenly and meant everything she was not saying. She said, "I know. That's why I married you." The second child arrived in February of 1877, and this time it was a girl, born in the same room as her brother with the same doctor and the same November wind outside replaced by a February one. And she was loud and dark-eyed, and resembled Eli so directly that Clara looked at the baby, and then looked at her husband with an expression of complete amusement. They named her June, because Clara had always loved the month, and because the name sat simply on her without trying to be more than it was. Young Thomas James, now 15 months old and walking with the determined if unsteady confidence of a boy who had decided that balance was something to be conquered, regarded his new sister with the serious attention of someone encountering an unknown element, and then, after a long moment, patted her blanket with one small, careful hand. Clara watched this and said very quietly that she thought they were going to be all right. Eli said, "They're going to be better than all right." She said, "Is that the stubbornness talking?" He said, "It's the experience talking. The stubbornness just agrees." Thomas and Ruth's first child was born in the spring of 1877, a boy they named Henry, and Dusty Creek marked the occasion with the particular warmth of a community that had watched one family arrive and take root and spread in all the ways that good things spread when they are given the right soil and enough time. The 12 acres east of town had grown, by the summer of 1877, into 18 acres. Eli having bought the adjacent parcel from an aging homesteader named Cyrus Webb, who was going to live with his daughter in Tucson, and no longer needed the land. The cattle operation was small but profitable enough to give Eli the first real sense of financial stability he had ever known, which was not the same as being wealthy, but was something considerably better than the alternative. He rode the boundary of his land one evening in June, the long summer light stretching the shadows of the fence posts across the dry grass, November moving beneath him with her steady, easy gait, and he thought about the train ticket. He thought about what it had cost him in terms of everything practical and everything measurable, and he calculated what it had returned. The calculation was not close. He rode back to the house and came in through the back door and found Clara at the table in her real kitchen, the one with the window she had argued for, feeding June, while young Thomas James sat on the floor nearby, talking at considerable length to a wooden horse Eli had carved for him in the winter. The lamplight was warm, and the supper smell was already in the air, and his wife looked up when he came in with the particular expression she had for him that was different from any other expression she had for anyone else, that particular warmth and directness combined, and he crossed the kitchen and kissed her and sat down and took his daughter for a moment so Clara could finish getting supper ready. June regarded him with the large, serious eyes she had inherited from her father and wrapped her small hand around his finger with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where she belongs. He said, to no one in particular and everyone present, "This is it." Clara at the stove said, "What is?" He said, "Everything. This is everything." Young Thomas James looked up from the floor with his wooden horse and said, with great authority and no apparent awareness that this was anything other than a reasonable contribution to the conversation, "Horse." Clara laughed, and the laugh surprised her in the familiar way, sudden and complete, and June, startled by the sound, looked toward her mother with wide eyes, and Eli held his daughter and looked at his wife and his son and the kitchen she had argued for, and the house he had built on the land he had bought with wages earned after arriving with nothing but himself, and he felt the full weight of it all pressed down on him, not as a burden but as a presence, solid and warm and completely, permanently real. The years that followed in Dusty Creek were the kind of years that built into something without making a dramatic announcement about the fact. Thomas recovered his full health by 1878 and ran his cattle operation alongside Eli's with the collaborative ease of men who trusted each other completely. Ruth and Clara became the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and disagreed productively, and were better together than either was separately. Henry Webb, as the community called Thomas's boy to distinguish him from young Thomas James, grew up alongside the Blackwell children with the familiarity of cousins. Eli expanded the ranch operation steadily, never faster than the land and the finances sensibly allowed, and by 1879 he had 22 acres and a small but dependable herd, and the respect of everyone in Dusty Creek who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. The foreman's position at Alderman's Ranch had long since been replaced by his own work on his own land, and Walt Alderman came by occasionally to look over the operation with the expression of a man who was pleased with how things had turned out. Clara's teaching work with Miss Garrett continued through the years, because she valued it, and because the children of Dusty Creek were the better for having someone with her particular kind of intelligence and patience in that schoolroom 3 days a week. She kept the ranch accounts with the same precision she had always brought to numbers, and Eli trusted her judgment in the financial decisions with a complete and practical faith that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with genuine respect. They had one more child, in 1879, another son they named William, who came into the world with a calm disposition that stood in notable contrast to both his older siblings, and who from his earliest months had the quality of simply being contented with whatever situation he found himself in, which Clara said was the most useful personality trait she could imagine, and Eli said was probably going to make him either a preacher or a diplomat. The house on the 18 acres had been expanded by then, a new room added for the children, the kitchen properly windowed and outfitted, the south porch where Eli and Clara sat on warm evenings with the mountains in view now properly railed, and wide enough for the pair of chairs they had bought in a moment of domestic luxury from a craftsman passing through. They sat on that porch on an evening in the late autumn of 1879, the three children inside being managed with varying degrees of success by young Thomas James, who at 4 years old had assumed the role of eldest sibling with a seriousness that made his parents periodically need to leave the room to compose themselves before returning. The mountains were doing the thing they did in the evenings, turning colors that moved from gold to orange to purple in the time it took to simply sit and watch them. Clara said, "Do you ever think about that train ticket?" He said, "All the time." She said, "Are you sorry you spent it?" He said, "Clara," she said, "I know the answer. I am asking so that I can hear you say it again." He said, "No, I am not sorry. I would spend it 1,000 times. I would sell every horse I ever own and walk every mile between here and wherever you are if that is what it requires. That has not changed." She looked at the mountains, and the evening light was on her face, and she was 30 years old, which in the New Mexico territory of 1879 put certain lines at the corners of her eyes, and the particular quality of steadiness in her features that life lived fully and honestly accumulates, and she was more completely beautiful to him than she had been in the street of Dusty Creek with 2 bags and the summer sun. And he had thought she was the most specific and irreplaceable thing he had ever seen on that very first afternoon. She said, "I think about my aunt's parlor sometimes. That evening." He said, "Which part?" She said, "The part where you said you had come with nothing but yourself, and I told you it was the most that anyone had ever brought me." She paused. "I meant it then. I mean it more now, which I did not think was possible." He said, "You have a habit of meaning things more than you thought was possible." She said, "I have a habit of being surprised by how things turn out." He said, "Good surprised or bad?" She turned and looked at him with the full warmth of her face, no careful control remaining, just all of it, straight out into the evening air between them. She said, "Eli Blackwell, look at this. Look at what we have. Look at where we are." He looked at her. He said, "I am looking." She said, "Does it seem possible to you? From that train platform in January." He thought about it honestly, the way she always asked him to think about things. He thought about the cold station in Albuquerque and the last coin and the second-class car and Floyd Danders and the biscuit and the gray Kansas winter and the 2 miles on foot from the station and knocking on a door at 14 Birchwood Lane with nothing in his pockets. He said, "No, it does not seem possible." "It seems like more than I had the right to hope for," she said. "It seems like exactly what you had the right to hope for. You just had to be stubborn enough to go get it." He said, "We had to be." She said, "Yes, we had to be." The porch boards were warm from the day's sun even in the autumn cooling, and inside the house, young Thomas James had apparently achieved some kind of ceasefire with his siblings, because the noise had settled into the lower register of children engaged in something quiet, and the mountains finished their color changing in the last of the light, and the first stars came out in the east, small and sharp, and the particular brightness that the high desert sky produced on clear evenings, which was most evenings. Clara put her hand over Eli's where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who have said what needs to be said and are simply present with each other now, which is what all of it was for in the end. The house behind them held their children. The land around them held their work. The mountains before them held the particular indifferent majesty that the West had always provided, free of charge and without sentimentality, to anyone willing to sit still long enough to receive it. Eli thought, "I came here with nothing but myself." He looked at his wife's hand in his, and then at her face in the last light of the evening, and then at the mountains, and then back at her. He thought, "I am the wealthiest man in New Mexico territory." He did not say this because some things were better held quietly, but Clara looked at him in the way she sometimes did, as though she had heard it anyway, and she squeezed his hand once firmly and turned back to the mountains. The stars came out one by one and then all at once, the way they always did in the desert, and the autumn air carried the clean, cold smell of sage and dry earth, and the faint far distance of wood smoke from the town to the west. And Eli and Clara Blackwell sat on the south porch of their house on the land they had built and stayed there long after the dark had settled completely, talking sometimes and silent sometimes, and entirely without question at home. Inside, young Thomas James fell asleep with his wooden horse clutched in one hand, and his sister June's blanket pulled sideways over him, with the carelessness of a child who has never had to worry about warmth, because it has always been provided, and baby William slept in his small bed with the even, untroubled breathing of a child at peace with the world. And the house held them all in the specific way that a house built with intention and love, and the accumulated labor of two people who chose each other, absolutely holds the things that matter inside it. The train ticket had cost Eli Blackwell his last dollar. It had bought him this: the land, the house, the children, the mountains in the evening, the woman beside him who saw him clearly and chose him anyway, the life that had seemed impossible from a cold January platform, and had turned out to be simply a matter of spending what you had and trusting the distance. He had arrived with nothing but himself. It had been, as it turned out, precisely enough.